Hello and welcome to the Nature Garden Podcast with me, Carl Steinson, and the weekending show team from Lionheart Radio. Thanks for joining us on a canny wee wander down the garden path and country lane with the birds and the bees and the flowers and trees, and it's a chance to hear some great stories from the past and present. In this episode, Tom Pattinson's checking some of the more common specimens in our gardens and asking, how well do you know them? Tom Cadwallender's out with the waders and the rising tides, and he's also looking back on the early years of his birding on the Northumberland coast. And we've got some top tips for the garden from Tom P, all coming up on the Nature Garden Podcast. Plants hold many mysteries within their multitude of forms and their mechanisms to protect and survive. And Tom Pattinson's taking a closer look at some of the plants in our gardens and lanes and at some of their challenging characteristics.
Hello. Isn't it just marvellous to be out in the garden on a sunny day at this time of year and look forward to the summer spreading out ahead of us? Youngsters on holiday from school, possibly going out for the day, or better still, why not stay in the garden? Lovely safe haven. That's the picture. Pierce on all our memories. But is it so safe? Not according to the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents, ROSPA for short. They tell us that every year there are thousands of accidents in and around the garden which are reported to A&E at the hospital. I just wonder how many accidents, small things like a bee sting or a nettle sting or just a little cut or a graze from a thorn on a rose, how many of those are not reported? And yet we can avoid all of them with a little thought at this time of year. Just think of the many hazards that lurk in the garden, in the summer garden. It's occasionally the simplest of things that cause accidents. Uneven pathways, heaps of assorted debris, tools left lying around when they should have been cleaned and put away, uncoiled hoses to trip over, ladders and steps. All of these account for so many minor accidents. And then it becomes more serious. Are there any chemicals around? Have they been locked away from the hands of and eyes of children? Is there machinery, electrically driven or petrol driven? Are there cutting blades? All of these things have to be taken into consideration. And safety first. If you're going to cut a hedge or use some shears, electric shears, make sure you've got a current breaking device attached to the socket which you're plugging into. Also make sure that your head, your eyes, your hands and your feet, if necessary, are protected by suitable clothing. All of these things you must think about. Well, it's worthwhile thinking about it. My goodness, yes. And if there's a barbecue out there, fire, children, excitement, or a pool, how deep is that pool? Is it safe if there are children around? And then we go to the most unlikely of items, the plants in the garden. Everyone trusts the plants in the garden. After all, someone chose them. They mustn't be poisonous, or they mustn't have a harmful effect on you. Well, put aside the poisonous plants for a moment and just think about those others. There are a number of plants which are quite capable of bringing out a case of dermatitis on your skin. Imagine this. You're going to handweed the vegetable patch because there's some small weeds there. You can't get in with the hoe, and you're going to put some gloves on because you've seen some little nettles, and tiny nettles give a big sting which will last for a few hours afterwards. So you put your gloves on, you do your hand weeding, you put the items you've collected into a tub to take to recycle or for your own compost heap, and then suddenly the underside of your skin, just above the glove line, tender skin there, it starts to itch, and then there's pain, and then there's a rash, and possibly blisters occur as well. Unfortunately, the sap of one of those weeds has touched your skin, and it's an attack of dermatitis. The most likely candidate is a spurge or euphorbia, member of the euphorbia family. If you go and look in the tub you've been putting your weeds in, you might just find it in there. It's the one with a broken stem and the milky white sap oozing from it. And this applies to cultivated euphorbias as well. They're beautiful decorative plants in the garden, but they all, if you break a leaf or a stem, that white sap comes out, and it really is a skin irritant. Other plants which have the same problem, or for you, are things like the herb borage, Borago officinalis, the botanical name, pulmonaria, that's lungwort, common name, pulmonaria, and mullein, that's a verbascum. The sap of those plants have a similar effect. And then it steps up a notch to the photosensitizers. That's the plants such as the giant hogweed, which is the daddy of them all, Heracleum mantagasianum. If that sap touches your skin, you have a big problem because it blisters. That's in the presence of the sun. The sunlight on your skin forms those blisters, and they're so painful, I understand. Thankfully, I've avoided that bit. And if you look online at the effect or adverse effect of giant hogweed, or Heracleum mantagasianum as it's called, you'll find that it lasts for a long time afterwards. Even when the blisters go, if you're out in the sun again, it's affected the cells on the surface of your skin. In sunlight, there's another reaction. So that really is one to avoid.
I'm Tom Heap from Countryfile, and you're listening to the Nature Garden podcast.
Tom Cadwallender's out and about this week counting wading birds down on the beautiful Almouth estuary, and he's contemplating the change in ornithological seasons and the merits of full moons and rising tides.
Here we are at the back end of July. Kind of summer's almost done. It's amazing. Where does the time go to? I'm sitting here at on my favourite seat, Tom's seat, on the Alm estuary, my favourite place. And it's absolutely fascinating. I love coming down here. And particularly at this time of year, because we're seeing quite a bit of change. You know, I come down on the estuary almost daily when I'm at home, and I'm seeing subtle changes all the time, and it's quite amazing actually. And really, if you just keep your eyes open, you can see these changes just unfolding before you. And at this time of year, it's actually becoming quite marked. And what I'm seeing is that during the early part of the summer and the spring, we've had nesting wading birds. And we've had pairs of red shanks, we had pairs of lapwings, and a few pairs of oyster catchers. And they've been quite successful, and they've raised their young, and they've kind of pushed off a little bit. But what we're seeing now is those populations of birds being kind of replaced by continental visitors. And these birds are coming from further north, and they're going to winter here. So can you imagine that? Here we are in kind of late July, and it's already kind of ornithological autumn, and soon it'll be ornithological winter, because these birds are going to be here for the autumn and winter. So yes, we're seeing a period of change. So we're seeing at the minute I'm counting something like 170 curlews on the mudflats and surrounding fields. Now, these birds have just arrived over the last sort of 10 days. There's been a few sort of stragglers over the summer, and these will be non-breeding birds. But the thing is, the birds that we have here on the east coast of Britain, in Northumberland, are birds which have come from further north in Scandinavia. And the Northumbrian breeding birds and the British breeding birds, they will leave and they will head south and west, and perhaps even into Ireland, perhaps even into northern Europe. Well, perhaps not Northern Europe, France and that sort of area, continental Europe. So yes, that void that they leave, those local breeding birds, will be backfilled by continental birds, birds from further north. And we're seeing the vanguard of those now sort of coming through. So we've got something like, I say, 170 to 200 birds, and I'm expecting 200 really quite soon. You may well have been able to hear them calling as I'm sitting here, because a great flock of them have just gone over. You'll hear them kind of call as they go over. Oh, and there's an aeroplane coming over as well. I do like sitting out here making these recordings, but you have to think about all the other things that are going on. But yeah, so we're seeing these birds coming in, and it's useful just to record the numbers. And I'm seeing that change. And we've seen the same with redshanks. And redshanks are kind of the real keeper of the marsh. They're the real noisy ones. And these birds, one or two pairs, have bred on the estuary, as I've mentioned. But we're seeing good numbers coming in from Iceland. And the young birds are kind of browner, and the grey and the older birds are tend to be greyer. So we're seeing them coming through in good numbers. So we're seeing that change, that subtle change. Lapwings are the same, and these birds start to arrive in the early July, and we're seeing sort of perhaps a couple of hundred already, and they'll cloud out the whole of the estuary. Absolutely fascinating to see that. So this is this change going on. And as I say, I monitor them on a daily basis when I'm around. But there is a scheme called the Wetland Birds Survey, or WEBS for short. And I do that once a month. And in fact, there is a team around the country doing these sort of surveys. And it's coordinated by the British Trust for Ornithology. And there are priority count dates. And this coming weekend is the start of the new priority season. I count throughout the summer, and I like to see the subtle changes of there's just the odd birds coming through. But actually, when it comes to the priority ones, it's amazing actually how you see the change, and it's timed perfectly to hit this autumn migration in July, to coincide with the full moon and when the tides are at their greatest, because it's easier to count when you've got a rising tide, because the birds are kind of pushed up the shore, and the opportunity to feed is reduced because the mud is getting covered up. So these birds are getting pushed up. So there's fewer places for them to go to. So they're easier to count. So that's the timing of it. So the full moon, so we have the bigger tidal range, and you try to count on a rising tide to get the maximum benefit. So it's actually quite fascinating. So my counts, I'll be counting again properly this weekend, and trying to get a good count for the WEBS weekend. And the species that I'm expecting to see are curlews, I know are here. There's lapwings, I know they're here. And redshanks, these birds are all going to be here for the winter time. But also seeing passage migrants. species like whimbrel. You may not have heard of a whimbrel, but it's a species it's a wading bird like the curlew, but that breeds further north. It's slightly smaller than a curlew and has quite a distinctive 3-note call as opposed to the curlew that whippet has. But also there's greenshank, a few greenshank coming in, and they are similar to redshank, slightly larger, but they have sort of grey-green legs, and these birds are coming from northern Scotland and indeed Scandinavia again. And common sandpipers, they breed in Northumberland. In fact, I cut my teeth, my kind of research teeth on working on common sandpipers and the cheviots, and I discovered that those birds that breed in the cheviots, I was checking on natal fidelity and so forth, migration routes, and those birds head straight down the country, straight down the middle of the country in a way. So the birds we see on the coast are continental birds. Again, like all these other species we've talked about, they're coming from afar, and they're using the Northumberland coast as a staging point. And the other day I found a green sandpiper, which is very similar to a common sandpiper, same sort of size-ish, and has the same sort of bobbing motion as a common sandpiper. But it's got its breast, it's got a kind of browny back, but it's got a breastband, a greyish breastband, and white underneath, whereas the common sandpiper has this little white hook at the side of its breast, which leads into its wing, where the green sandpiper doesn't. It sort of spreads right across. It's even right across the front of the breast, and its underwing is black. So yes, there's unusual things happening as well. But also, quite interestingly, there are 3 avocets here. Avocets are black and white birds with an upcurved bill, and they've got blue legs. Startling, really, but they are the emblem of the RSPB, and if you're kind of familiar with the emblem, you'll recognise them straight away. But there's two young ones and one adult. They've bred locally, and they're kind of just here on the mud, and they've got quite a piping noise, and they're quite distinctive when they come through. So yes, there's a lot of stuff going on here, and you only notice these things when you kind of regularly watch a place and you pick out the sort of subtle differences. But we have to record things because that's how we kind of feed into the bigger melting pot of kind of our ornithological knowledge, our kind of pooled knowledge, and it helps us kind of figure out what's going on and recognise there are changes through climate change, through temperature rise and all sorts of things, and it helps us identify things. So yes, I will do my webs count once a month, but this weekend, back of July, is the start of the priority counts, where people like me from around the country will going out onto their local patches and counting these wading birds on the move. They also count wildfowl, although it's still slightly early for some wildfowl species just yet, but they'll be doing it all the same. And it's great to be part of a team, even though we never meet up. We share information via social media, but it's great to be part of a team, and you're contributing to the bigger picture, the huge picture. It's wonderful, and that kind of keeps me going. That really makes all the difference. So I'm sitting here watching big numbers of lapwing just on the mud as the tide's pushing them up, and curlews are around as well. But it's wonderful. I love it. This is kind of me living the dream, as it were. So anyway, folks, gan canny, and I'll see you soon. Bye now.
Now let's go back to Tom Pattinson, who's taking care in the garden and asking, how well do you know your plants? And you know what? There's something here for us all to learn.
I mentioned giant hogweed, Heracleum mantagasianum. It's against the law to propagate that plant. It was brought to this country by the Victorians to make a bold statement in our herbaceous borders. It escaped to the wild, and now it bedevils our river systems and costs local council tens of thousands of pounds every year to try to eradicate it. So it's not a good idea to encourage it. Anyway, it's against the law to propagate it. Another one, not quite in the same league, but nonetheless it's a photosensitizer, is a plant called rue, the one that the bard Shakespeare mentioned in that play, Ruta graveolens. It generally has the same effect on you, and the sap, if the sap comes out from the stem, a white sap, look out for that. In the kitchen during food preparation, it's where you not expect to have a reaction from a plant that's been collected from the garden, from the vegetable garden. But how many of us start to peel an onion and have a tearful response? Could do without that. The eyes are sore for a while, but we can recover. Meanwhile, out in the garden, amongst the flowers, there are quite a few favourites which can give you a surprise. They're disagreeable at close quarters. Careful how you handle the leaves of chamomile, or the pot marigold, or pyrethrum. Marguerite's another one, and larkspur, and hellebore, of course. And what about ivy? Not that poison ivy I'm talking about, although Toxicodendron radicans, which is poison ivy, can give you a nasty rash. I'm talking about our native ivy, Hedera helix. It is an irritant, and you need to wear gloves when you're handling it. You know, some people can remember warnings that have been given to them over time. Sometimes it slips our mind, but one of the favourite warnings from history, from the 17th century actually, the earlier part, came from John Gerard, the herbalist, based in London. And he wrote, "Non est semper fide habenda frontae." Appearances are not always to be trusted. And then on to poisonous plants. Plants you grow in your own garden. When we start a 20-minute tour around the poison garden in Alnwick, I'm a voluntary garden guide in the poison garden. We all start off by warning the 20 people in our group, don't touch, taste or smell anything. No sniffing, no licking, no touching. We've done this for years. 20 years come up next year. And it begs the question, how well do you know your plants in the garden? Because some of the people, or most of the people who come around, they'll say, "Oh, I've got that in the garden. I didn't know that was poisonous." But it is the case. Which leads me up nicely to, having done this for 20 years, taking tours around the poison garden in Alnwick, along with some of the other guides there, we got together recently and thought, look, we've been researching poisonous plants all of this time. We've been taking 20-minute tours, goodness knows how many over the years, and there's a lot of knowledge there. Let's turn it into a book, which we have. It's been a team effort, and a couple of really talented ladies in the office have put it all together, and it's worth a look. It's called The Poison Garden Alnwick, and it's retails there in the shop only. It's 223 pages, hardback. It's got lots of illustrations in, and of course information about the poisonous plants that we grow in Alnwick, in the poison garden, somewhere near 100, and others, of course, and more. So it's really worthwhile. It's an A to Z book. Those 223 pages are really well filled, and it costs £15 for a hardback, which I think is quite good. Anyway, if you're interested in that, you can get it at the Alnwick Garden Shop online at www.thepinery.co.uk. You might be interested in that. Plants apart, have a really lovely time in that garden of yours. Sorry for the slightly negative tone, but if one person has saved a sting or a rash or something of that nature from me mentioning it, I'll be a happy fellow.
Tom Cadwallender's going back to his roots and reminiscing on the old mining pond habitats of his youth and the joys of the Asherton bus and Shanks's pony on some classic coastal walks.
As a lad growing up in southeast Northumberland, kind of learning my birdwatching kind of credentials, or just get some experience in them about. Southeast Northumberland wasn't a particularly birdy area, although there were some quite good hotspots. And quite close to home, there was Bottle Pond, which we knew it as Conygarth. Conygarth relates to an old kind of rabbit rearing area. It was a warren basically, and created by the Romans seemingly. Anyway, they used to have rabbits there. But anyway, this pond, which was a mining subsidence pond, was called Conygarth, and it became quite famous as Bottle Pond. And that's where I'd had my kind of first bird watching experiences. I used to walk from home across the fields to this pond and back again. When I say walk, that's kind of really what I had to do, unless I got the bus, because it was quite a hard old life. You know, it was loving life, but it was pretty tough. We didn't have a lot of spare cash, so we didn't have a car. So I had to make my own way around finding things. And one of my favourite things to do back in those days of the kind of early 70s was to get a bus from home to Ashington, and then a bus from Ashington to Cresswell. And Cresswell is the seaside, basically, and on Druridge Bay. And I'd heard about this place called Cresswell Pond, you know, through the grapevine. What was a poor version of the grapevine compared to these days. But I heard about this place, and there were some good birds turning up. So what I used to do was to get the bus, and it was the 377, I seem to remember, and get the bus down to Cresswell and walk up the whole length of Druridge Bay, and it was about 7.5 miles, up to Amble, and get the bus home from Amble at the end of the day. And it was just wonderful. I used to do this on a regular basis, not every week, but perhaps every month or so. And doing it through the seasons, I saw some quite fascinating things. And I got some great experiences. And if you're watching places on a fairly regular basis, you do get a chance to see the changes, the seasonal changes, that is. And spending early years on Druridge Bay meant I did see some landscape changes. Indeed, I saw those at home at my favoured Bottle Pond, or Conygarth. Conygarth started out as a mining subsidence pond, and the whole area of southeast Northumberland was heavily mined back in the day. You know, really heavily mined. It's got a lot of coal underlying the surface, and these subsidence ponds were created by the old mining kind of seams, which had been excavated, were collapsing, and they created little hollows, and which filled with water, and gradually sort of these little hollows became established wet areas. The vegetation helped, and and birds found them. It was fascinating, and so that was Bottle Pond. But actually, getting back onto Druridge Bay, Cresswell Pond was exactly the same. And indeed, Cresswell Pond became a site of special scientific interest. It was a mining subsidence pond, and it was developed back in the 50s, I suppose, and it had an immense reputation. So I used to walk up from the village of Cresswell, where the bus would drop me off, and I'd walk up, it was probably about a mile, to the pond. In those days, it was before the Northumberland Wildlife Trust, who have done a fabulous job, by the way, of Druridge Bay, before they got involved. And walking up past along the road, and you would spend a bit of time there, a little reed bed and shallow water, and occasionally it would flood. And it was designated a site of special scientific interest because of a couple of invertebrate species that were in the pool, and the pool was regularly inundated by salt water, so it was quite brackish. So these invertebrates were quite specialised. So it was fairy shrimps they were. So this pool was designated for them and for wintering whooper swans. And there used to be a big herd of whooper swans would be there during the winter time. And it was amazing. And some really quite rare waders would turn up there. And, you know, it was amazing. So, yes, that would be my first stop. And I would walk up from there through what became Druridge Pools. And Druridge Pools was a series of wet meadows now. And that was as a result of deep mining and subsidence. But there was also a huge, big lake there, and that was a result of the radar opencast site back in the late the late 70s. And the pools themselves were great. I found the first record of breeding blue-headed wagtail, which is a race of yellow-headed wagtail. Yellow wagtail, rather. A race of yellow wagtail breeding there. It was the first record for Northumberland. Quite an unusual species, and they do drift across the North Sea, so it's a continental race. So they do drift over there, and I found them, and we ringed the chicks as well, which is great. And from there, we walked up, and there was no big pools there. We're all just sort of shallow subsidence ponds, and we find all sorts of things in those. And in those days, it was pre-East Chevington Nature Reserve, another Northumberland Wildlife Trust nature reserve, and it was there was a drift there, drift mine, which led to the setting up of a small hamlet, which is Chevington Drift. There was 2 or 3 rows there, and but that was cleared when they decided they wanted to open cast. And I did mention that this whole area had been underlain by huge coal deposits, which made it rich and quite valuable in terms of digging out for our fossil fuel in those days when we'd actually dug our own fossil fuel. So yes, before those days, and then shortly after the East Chevington Reserve, or shortly before rather, the East Chevington Reserve, we had Druridge Bay Country Park, which was a Northumberland it's a Northumberland County Council site. And indeed, I went on to manage that area through the late 1980s into the early 1990s. And then I would carry on again through kind of just scrub woodland. And scrub woodland, it's a really unsung habitat, and it's a habitat which is so valuable. But we tend not to take it quite seriously, because scrub woodland, what is that about? It's not like a forest, is it? But yeah, it's as good as a forest, though. It's low, scrubby woodland made up of kind of hawthorns and brambles and all manner of kind of low-growing shrubs, which are quite useful on the coastal strip because they do provide a lot of good habitat for migrant small birds coming through during spring and autumn. And from there, from those areas, I eventually ended up at Low Hawksley, where we had a ringing station at the Whittle Wood behind Low Hawksley village, and I trained to ring birds there. And I spent lots and lots of time there during the mid-1970s, mid to late 1970s, catching and ringing all manner of birds. And I really sort of learned a huge amount there. And that area had been heavily open-casted in the day again. Coal was the big influence. And that became the Northumberland Wildlife Trust flagship reserve of Hawksley. And you go there now, you wouldn't think it could be the same place. It's just full of all sorts of wonderful habitats, which we never really dreamt of back in the days when I was kind of cutting my teeth on Druridge Bay. And then I would walk up from Low Hawksley up into Amble, and then we'd pass by Coquet Island at the north end of Druridge Bay. And we know now that Coquet Island is just a wonderful RSPB reserve, and I spend a lot of my springs and summers there, helping to monitor roseate terns. In fact, Coquet Island is the stronghold in the UK for roseate terns, and I've been involved with it since the early 1990s. Monitoring the species. So it was a great privilege. I've been involved in that. You may have heard me talk about that in previous podcasts. But then I would end up in Amble, yes, and it was kind of onto the harbour there, and you'd see what was in the harbour, and you'd see all sorts of seabirds and sea ducks, and depending on the season. And, I was just thinking about that whole kind of period. I must be getting maudlin or something, because it kind of took me back to some wonderful old days, and I really kind of had a little bit of reminisce in my own head, just thinking about those wonderful times when, didn't have any money, didn't have a car. I used my Shanks's pony and got the bus from home to learn about birds and coastal birds, and that's ingrained in me now. Coastal birds are my most favourite of groups of birds. I really love the coastal birds. Fantastic. But yes, it's interesting when you sort of go back to your kind of roots, my ornithological roots. Fantastic. Really quite wonderful times. I really kind of think quite fondly about those times. Anyway, sorry, I'm rambling now. Sorry about that. Gan canny, folks, and we'll see you soon. Bye now.
And now, to the sound of War Blackbird, here's Tom with some things to be getting on with in the garden.
Yeah, well, it's jobs for the week time, and I've been concentrating on the soft fruits this week, and coming days I'll be tidying up the strawberry beds. They've had the main crop, and there are some runners there to release. That's the young shoots coming off, which give me the new plants. After 3-4 years, I get rid of the older plants, which have lost some of their vigour and more susceptible to disease, dig them out and put them into the compost facility, and keep young plants coming on every year, just to keep regenerating them. The raspberries have been good recently. Good. I have two types. I have the floricane, which is the main crop, which is July into August, and a primocane, which are the autumn crop ones. The thing to do at the moment, if yours have finished fruiting, mine are still fruiting, but as soon as they finish fruiting, get rid of the old canes which have just borne the fruit, and you'll see new ones, young ones, coming alongside them, sort of paler colour of cane. Cut out the old canes which have just fruited down at the base near the ground level, and tie in the young canes which will carry on growing. Tie them into your supports. This year they'll carry on growing and they'll ripen and give you the fruit next year. Moving on from that to the black currants and the gooseberries and the red currants. They've all given me quite a lot of fruit. The blackbirds are still giving attention to the red currants and black currants. They've had more than their share. I haven't had those bushes netted, so it's time for me to pick our share of the spoils, the fruit. When that's finished, I'll look at the blackcurrant. It can be done immediately after it's finished fruiting, or it can be done when it's lost its leaves in the autumn, going into winter, when of course you get a better view of the whole plant. But it will need some pruning. The idea of blackcurrants is to regenerate some new wood every other year, if you can, every year perhaps. So I take out one of the old stems which is fruited, and that encourages more to come from the base, keeps the plant young and vigorous. The gooseberries, they're getting a bit overcrowded at the centre, and I need an open centre to get air going through it to avoid mildew, which sometimes attacks if there's congested at the centre and no flow of air. That will be done, but a bit later on. Pick the fruit, because the birds just love that, the blackbirds especially. Pick as much fruit as you can at the moment. I've noticed that the butterflies have been very late this year, especially the red admiral, peacock, tortoiseshell, painted lady. Normally see them around by now. And the sad thing is that the budlegia, or butterfly bush, is full of flower, those long spikes of flower. And I haven't seen bees on it, but not a single butterfly. That's so sad. I'm hoping they turn up shortly. Also, I have the hebe in full bloom. It has flower spikes as well. The hebe, or Veronica, is just brilliant at the moment, but no butterflies, just bees. So we look forward to them arriving soon. What has arrived, trust it to be, is the cabbage white butterfly. This week they've just arrived with me, getting into the third week in July, and I've had to net the winter cabbages and the other brassica crops there, because they'll lay their eggs on the underside of the leaves, and before we know it, they'll be stripped bare by when the eggs hatch into caterpillars. So that's there to cover over now. I'm also looking around at the leaf lettuce. We grow leaf lettuce rather than the hearting lettuce, because you can cut and come again. Hearting lettuce takes a few weeks for the lettuce plants to develop a heart, then one cut and it's finished. This way, with leaf lettuce, it's a continuous supply. Well, this supply has lasted us for 3 months now, so it's time to sow anew. And oddly enough, we sowed out to the open garden just 3 days ago, and with the warmth and the moisture, already they're germinating. So keep the leaf lettuce going and the radishes. Tomatoes, they're not ripened yet, but I'm removing some of the lower leaves on the plant. They're old now, and this allows some air to get in, a circulation of air, and more light. I've got green tomatoes. They need a bit of light to get them ripened. That's hopefully happening soon. I'm taking stemwood cuttings of shrubs outside, and also things like penstemons and fuchsias and herbs. Softwood stem cuttings, they root very easily. That's enough to be going on with. So I won't see you for a few weeks now, but all of that time, enjoy your gardening.
You've been listening to gardener Tom Pattinson, birder Tom Cadwallender from the British Trust for Ornithology, and a big thanks to our other correspondents over the last season of programmes, Steve Lowe from the Northumberland Rivers Trust and Cresswell Peel Tower, and John Knox and Dean Smith from the Alnwick Poison Garden. We're taking a break now for summer, but we'll be back in September with more nature, gardening and heritage reports from Northumberland and beyond. I'm Carl Steinson. Thanks for listening and enjoy your gardening and time outdoors with nature. Bye for now.